We now present An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, written by Ambrose Bierce. Before the story begins, here is a brief listening guide. Set during the American Civil War, Ambrose Bierce's 1890 masterpiece is a pioneering work of psychological fiction that immerses audiences in the subjective experience of time during profound trauma. Bierce, a Union veteran, uses intimate military knowledge to contrast cold, procedural execution with the desperate, vivid human will to survive. As you listen, pay close attention to auditory imagery, such as the metallic ticking of a pocket watch, which brilliantly blurs the precise boundary between objective reality and the protagonist's desperate internal sensation. Now, let the story begin. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the ties supporting the rails of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners. Two private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support, that is to say, vertical, in front of the left shoulder. The hammer resting on the forearm thrown straight across the chest. It was a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be the duty of these two men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the two ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle slope topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway up the slope, between the bridge and fort, were the spectators. A single company of infantry in line, at parade rest, the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of four at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The centiths, facing the banks of the stream, might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary, who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good: a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a mustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark gray, and had a kindly expression which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hemp. Evidently, this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the two private soldiers stepped aside, and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind that officer, who in turn moved apart one pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing at the two ends of the same plank, which spanned 3 of the cross ties of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood almost, but not quite, reached a 4th. This plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain. It was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the former, the latter would step aside, the plank would tilt, and the condemned man go down between 2 ties. The arrangement commended itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face had not been covered, nor his eyes bandaged. He looked a moment at his unsteadfast footing, then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing madly beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move! What a sluggish stream! He closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mists under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, and the piece of drift, all had distracted him. And now he became conscious of a new disturbance. Striking through the thought of his dear ones was sound which he could neither ignore nor understand, a sharp, distinct metallic percussion, like the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer upon the anvil. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was, and whether immeasurably distant or nearby. It seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. He awaited each new stroke with impatience, and, he knew not why, apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer. The delays became maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. They hurt his ear like the thrust of a knife. He feared he would shriek. What he heard was the ticking of his watch. He unclosed his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving, I could evade the bullets, and swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. As these thoughts, which have here to be set down in words, were flashed into the doomed man's brain rather than evolved from it, The captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside. Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter of an old and highly respected Alabama family. Being a slave owner, and, like other slave owners, a politician, he was naturally an original secessionist and ardently devoted to the Southern cause. Circumstances of an imperious nature, which it is unnecessary to relate here, had prevented him from taking service with that gallant army which had fought the disastrous campaigns, ending with the fall of Corinth. And he chafed under the inglorious restraint, longing for the release of his energies, the larger life of the soldier, the opportunity for distinction. That opportunity, he felt, would come, as it comes to all in wartime. Meanwhile, he did what he could. No service was too humble for him to perform in the aid of the South, no adventure too perilous for him to undertake, if consistent with the character of a civilian who was at heart a soldier, and who, in good faith and without too much qualification, assented to at least a part of the frankly villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war. One evening, while Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a rustic bench near the entrance to his grounds, a gray-clad soldier rode up to the gate and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Farquhar was only too happy to serve him with her own white hands. While she was fetching the water, her husband approached the dusty horseman and inquired eagerly for news from the front. "The Yanks are repairing the railroads," said the man, "and are getting ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order, and built a stockade on the north bank. The commandant has issued an order, which is posted everywhere, declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroad, its bridges, tunnels, or trains will be summarily hanged. I saw the order." "How far is it to the Owl Creek Bridge?" Farquhar asked. "About 30 miles. Is there no force on this side of the creek?" "Only a picket post half a mile out on the railroad, and a single sentinel at this end of the bridge." "Suppose a man, a civilian and student of hanging, should elude the picket post and perhaps get the better of the sentinel," said Farquhar, smiling. "What could he accomplish?" The soldier reflected. "I was there a month ago," he replied. "I observed that the flood of last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden pier at this end of the bridge. It is now dry and would burn like tinder." The lady had now brought the water, which the soldier drank. He thanked her ceremoniously, bowed to her husband, and rode away. An hour later, after nightfall, he repassed the plantation, going northward in the direction from which he had come. He was a Federal scout. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight downward through the bridge, he lost consciousness and was as one already dead. From this state he was awakened, ages later, it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fiber of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined lines of ramification, and to beat with an inconceivably rapid periodicity. They seemed like streams of pulsating fire, heating him to an intolerable temperature. As to his head, he was conscious of nothing but a feeling of fullness, of congestion. These sensations were unaccompanied by thought. The intellectual part of his nature was already effaced. He had power only to feel, and feeling was torment. He was conscious of motion. Encompassed in a luminous cloud, of which he was now merely the fiery heart, without material substance, he swung through unthinkable arcs of oscillation, like a vast pendulum. Then, all at once, with terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward with the noise of a loud splash. A frightful roaring was in his ears, and all was cold and dark. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken, and he had fallen into the stream. There was no additional strangulation. The noose about his neck was already suffocating him, and kept the water from his lungs. To die of hanging at the bottom of a river. The idea seemed to him ludicrous. He opened his eyes in the darkness and saw above him a gleam of light. But how distant, how inaccessible. He was still sinking, for the light became fainter and fainter until it was a mere glimmer. Then it began to grow and brighten, and he knew that he was rising toward the surface, knew it with reluctance, for he was now very comfortable. To be hanged and drowned, he thought, that is not so bad, but I do not wish to be shot. No, I will not be shot. That is not fair. He was not conscious of an effort, but a sharp pain in his wrist apprised him that he was trying to free his hands. He gave the struggle his attention, as an idler might observe the feat of a juggler, without interest in the outcome. What splendid effort! What magnificent, what superhuman strength! Ah, that was a fine endeavor. Bravo! The cord fell away. His arms parted and floated upward, the hands dimly seen on each side in the growing light. He watched them with a new interest, as first one and then the other pounced upon the noose at his neck. They tore it away and thrust it fiercely aside, its undulations resembling those of a water snake. "Put it back! Put it back!" He thought he shouted these words to his hands, for the undoing of the noose had been succeeded by the direst pang that he had yet experienced. His neck ached horribly. His brain was on fire. His heart, which had been fluttering faintly, gave a great leap, trying to force itself out at his mouth. His whole body was racked and wrenched with an insupportable anguish. But his disobedient hands gave no heed to the command. They beat the water vigorously with quick downward strokes, forcing him to the surface. He felt his head emerge. His eyes were blinded by the sunlight. His chest expanded convulsively, and with a supreme and crowning agony, his lungs engulfed a great draught of air, which instantly he expelled in a shriek. He was now in full possession of his physical senses. They were, indeed, preternaturally keen and alert. Something in the awful disturbance of his organic system had so exalted and refined them that they made record of things never before perceived. He felt the ripples upon his face and heard their separate sounds as they struck. He looked at the forest on the bank of the stream, saw the individual trees, the leaves and the veining of each leaf. He saw the very insects upon them, the locusts, the brilliant-bodied flies, the gray spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He noted the prismatic colors in all the dewdrops upon a million blades of grass. The humming of the gnats that danced above the eddies of the stream, the beating of the dragonfly's wings, the strokes of the water spider's legs, like oars which had lifted their boat. All these made audible music. A fish slid along beneath his eyes, and he heard the rush of its body parting the water. He had come to the surface facing down the stream. In a moment, the visible world seemed to wheel slowly round, himself the pivotal point, and he saw the bridge, the fort, the soldiers upon the bridge, the captain, the sergeant, the two privates. His executioners. They were in silhouette against the blue sky. They shouted and gesticulated, pointing at him. The captain had drawn his pistol, but did not fire. The others were unarmed. Their movements were grotesque and horrible, their forms gigantic. Suddenly, he heard a sharp report, and something struck the water smartly within a few inches of his head, spattering his face with spray. He heard a second report, and saw one of the sentinels with his rifle at his shoulder, a light cloud of blue smoke rising from the muzzle. The man in the water saw the eye of the man on the bridge gazing into his own through the sights of the rifle. He observed that it was a gray eye, and remembered having read that gray eyes were keenest, and that all famous marksmen had them. Nevertheless, this one had missed. A counter-swirl had caught Farquhar and turned him half round. He was again looking at the forest on the bank opposite the fort. The sound of a clear, high voice in a monotonous sing-song now rang out behind him and came across the water with a distinctness that pierced and subdued all other sounds, even the beating of the ripples in his ears. Although no soldier, he had frequented camps enough to know the dread significance of that deliberate, drawling, aspirated chant. The lieutenant on shore was taking a part in the morning's work. How coldly and pitilessly, with what an even, calm intonation, presaging and enforcing tranquility in the men, with what accurately measured interval fell those cruel words. Company! Attention! Shoulder arms! Ready! Aim! Fire! Farquhar dived. He dived as deeply as he could. The water roared in his ears like the voice of Niagara, yet he heard the dull thunder of the volley, and rising again toward the surface, met shining bits of metal, singularly flattened, oscillating slowly downward. Some of them touched him on the face and hands, then fell away, continuing their descent. One lodged between his collar and neck. It was uncomfortably warm, and he snatched it out. As he rose to the surface, gasping for breath, he saw that he had been a long time under water. He was perceptibly farther downstream, nearer to safety. The soldiers had almost finished reloading. The metal ramrods flashed all at once in the sunshine as they were drawn from the barrels, turned in the air, and thrust into their sockets. The two sentinels fired again, independently and ineffectually. The hunted man saw all this over his shoulder. He was now swimming vigorously with the current. His brain was as energetic as his arms and legs. He thought with the rapidity of lightning. The officer, he reasoned, will not make that martinet's error a second time. It is as easy to dodge a volley as a single shot. He has probably already given the command to fire at will. God help me, I cannot dodge them all. An appalling splash within 2 yards of him was followed by a loud rushing sound, diminuendo, which seemed to travel back through the air to the fort and died in an explosion which stirred the very river to its deeps. A rising sheet of water curved over him, fell down upon him, blinded him, strangled him. The cannon had taken a hand in the game. As he shook his head free from the commotion of the smitten water, he heard the deflected shot humming through the air ahead. And in an instant, it was cracking and smashing the branches in the forest beyond. They will not do that again, he thought. The next time they will use a charge of grape. I must keep my eye upon the gun. The smoke will apprise me. The report arrives too late. It lags behind the missile. That is a good gun. Suddenly, he felt himself whirled round and round, spinning like a top. The water, the banks, the forests, the now distant bridge, fort, and men, all were commingled and blurred. Objects were represented by their colors only. Circular horizontal streaks of color were all he saw. He had been caught in a vortex and was being whirled on with a velocity of advance and gyration that made him giddy and sick. In a few moments, he was flung upon the gravel at the foot of the left bank of the stream, the southern bank, and behind a projecting point which concealed him from his enemies. The sudden arrest of his motion, the abrasion of one of his hands on the gravel, restored him, and he wept with delight. He dug his fingers into the sand, threw it over himself in handfuls, and audibly blessed it. It looked like diamonds, rubies, emeralds. He could think of nothing beautiful which it did not resemble. The trees upon the bank were giant garden plants. He noted a definite order in their arrangement, inhaled the fragrance of their blooms. A strange roseate light shone through the spaces among their trunks, and the wind made in their branches the music of aeolian harps. He had no wish to perfect his escape. He was content to remain in that enchanting spot until retaken. A whiz and a rattle of grape shot among the branches high above his head roused him from his dream. The baffled cannoneer had fired him a random farewell. He sprang to his feet, rushed up the sloping bank, and plunged into the forest. All that day he traveled, laying his course by the rounding sun. The forest seemed interminable. Nowhere did he discover a break in it, not even a woodman's road. He had not known that he lived in so wild a region. There was something uncanny in the revelation. By nightfall, he was fatigued, footsore, famished. The thought of his wife and children urged him on. At last, he found a road which led him in what he knew to be the right direction. It was as wide and straight as a city street, yet it seemed untraveled. No fields bordered it, no dwelling anywhere. Not so much as the barking of a dog suggested human habitation. The black bodies of the trees formed a straight wall on both sides, terminating on the horizon in a point, like a diagram in a lesson in perspective. Overhead, as he looked up through this rift in the wood, shone great golden stars, looking unfamiliar and grouped in strange constellations. He was sure they were arranged in some order which had a secret and malign significance. The wood on either side was full of singular noises, among which, once, twice, and again, he distinctly heard whispers in an unknown tongue. His neck was in pain, and lifting his hand to it, found it horribly swollen. He knew that it had a circle of black where the rope had bruised it. His eyes felt congested. He could no longer close them. His tongue was swollen with thirst. He relieved its fever by thrusting it forward from between his teeth into the cold air. How softly the turf had carpeted the untraveled avenue. He could no longer feel the roadway beneath his feet. Doubtless, despite his suffering, he had fallen asleep while walking, for now he sees another scene. Perhaps he has merely recovered from a delirium. He stands at the gate of his own home. All is as he left it, and all bright and beautiful in the morning sunshine. He must have traveled the entire night. As he pushes open the gate and passes up the wide, white walk, he sees a flutter of female garments. His wife, looking fresh and cool and sweet, steps down from the veranda to meet him. At the bottom of the steps she stands waiting, with a smile of ineffable joy, an attitude of matchless grace and dignity. Ah, how beautiful she is! He springs forwards with extended arms. As he is about to clasp her, he feels a stunning blow upon the back of the neck. A blinding white light blazes all about him with a sound like the shock of a cannon, and then all is darkness and silence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. The reading is followed by a deeper literary commentary. Ambrose Bierce's short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, stands as a pinnacle of experimental fiction that intricately structures the ineffable boundaries between objective reality and the human mind's desperate illusions. Bierce deftly intertwines his own biographical experiences and precise geographical knowledge with deeply psychological narrative techniques, creating a grounded sense of location that anchors the story's more surreal and hallucinatory elements. The narrative is deliberately infused with a distinct wry seriousness, artfully blending grim realities with subtle irony as it meticulously explores the impending doom of its protagonist. Through an exceptionally uncanny dream structure, Bierce subverts traditional storytelling conventions, acutely capturing the fragmented and temporally distorted nature of human consciousness during the final moments of life. This profound psychological depth transforms a seemingly straightforward tale of execution into a mesmerizing exploration of time, perception, and the inescapability of mortality. By seamlessly shifting between the cold reality of the hanging and the protagonist's subjective cognitive experience, Bierce generates an atmospheric tension that lingers long after the story's startling revelation. His remarkable ability to navigate the complexities of the human psyche while maintaining a meticulously constructed and biographically significant physical setting showcases his enduring contribution to American literary realism. The narrative is not merely reliant on a superficial trick ending, but rather functions as a carefully orchestrated descent into a profound dream state, ultimately revealing the mind's extraordinary capacity to fabricate hope in the face of absolute destruction. Bierce's courageous exploration of these uncanny psychological depths, combined with his precise attention to geographical reality, cements his legacy as a writer who relentlessly dared to push the boundaries of narrative form. His complex work demands careful navigation of the psychological terrain, challenging readers to parse the subtle distinctions between the unforgiving objective world and the elaborate subjective illusions born of human desperation. The structural brilliance of the story lies predominantly in how seamlessly it transitions from a stark, realistic depiction of military justice into an expansive, deeply internalized journey of imagined escape, ultimately proving that the most profound occurrences transpire not within the physical world, but deeply within the isolated confines of the dying mind, rendering the ineffable tragically concrete. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is universally lauded as a seminal text in American literature, masterfully bridging the gap between 19th century realism and 20th century psychological modernism. Ambrose Bierce orchestrates a narrative that fundamentally questions the reliability of human perception under the extreme duress of imminent death. By fracturing the chronological timeline into three distinct sections, Bierce manipulates the reader's understanding of objective reality versus subjective experience. The text fundamentally alters our expectation of narrative truth. The story operates as a profound philosophical inquiry into the mechanics of consciousness, the instinct for self-preservation, and the deceptive nature of hope. Through a meticulously controlled, omniscient narrator that seamlessly transitions into a limited internal perspective, Bierce invites the reader to inhabit the mind of a condemned man whose final moments stretch into an expansive eternity. The narrative commences with a clinical detachment that mirrors the rigid military protocols governing the execution. Peyton Farquhar stands bound upon the bridge, his impending death orchestrated with mechanical precision by Union soldiers whose movements are dictated by a stringent code of military etiquette. Bierce's prose in this sequence is distinctly objective, describing the placement of the soldiers and the silent reverence demanded by the presence of death. The stark juxtaposition between external stillness and internal chaos is masterful. This emotional detachment firmly establishes the inescapable reality of Farquhar's situation and provides a stark stylistic contrast to the vivid internal monologue that follows. The transition from objective reality to cognitive distortion is brilliantly marked by the auditory intrusion of Farquhar's ticking watch. Initially perceived as a metallic percussion resembling a blacksmith's hammer, the sound becomes agonizingly slow and overwhelmingly loud, illustrating the psychological dilation of time. This auditory hyper-awareness signals the complete detachment of Farquhar's consciousness from his physical surroundings, laying the groundwork for the psychological escape fantasy. In the second section, Bierce employs a strategic flashback, providing essential context regarding Farquhar's identity and the circumstances leading to his execution. Farquhar is a wealthy Alabama planter who, unable to join the Confederate Army, romanticizes the glory of war and yearns for a heroic opportunity to serve the Southern cause. This romanticization proves to be his fatal flaw. Bierce critically dismantles the mythos of the noble Southern gentleman by exposing Farquhar's naive belief that all is fair in love and war. It is a blistering critique of the vainglorious pursuit of battlefield martyrdom. His willingness to commit sabotage based on the casual suggestion of a thirsty, gray-clad soldier highlights a profound disconnect between the brutal reality of actual warfare and the idealized visions harbored by eager civilians. The revelation that the soldier is actually a disguised Federal scout operates as devastating dramatic irony. Farquhar is easily manipulated because the scout plays directly into his grandiose fantasies of military heroism. This middle section grounds the soaring psychological flight of the third part in a concrete narrative reality, while serving as cynical commentary on the destructive nature of rigid wartime ideology. The final and most extensive section thrusts the reader unreservedly into the bewildering realm of subjective cognitive experience. As Farquhar physically plunges through the bridge, the narrative closely tracks his cognitive rebellion against death. The imagined breaking of the rope initiates a sequence of sensory hyper-awareness that is awe-inspiring in its beauty and deeply unsettling in its implications. Bierce details Farquhar's seemingly miraculous escape from the river, describing his heightened perceptions with poetic intensity. The boundary between physical reality and psychological projection entirely dissolves. Farquhar miraculously observes the intricate veining of individual leaves, prismatic colors in dewdrops, and the audible beating of gnats. This sensory acuity is initially interpreted as the adrenaline-fueled state of a desperate man fighting for his life. However, upon retrospective analysis, these details are profoundly unnatural and physically impossible to perceive, serving as subtle clues that the entire escape is a fabrication conjured by a dying brain. The physical impossibilities mount exponentially, dodging a volley of bullets, surviving a massive vortex, and traveling endlessly through a forest resembling a sterile geometric diagram. The environment becomes increasingly hallucinatory, reflecting the progressive biological failure of his body and the desperate leaps of his fading consciousness. The narrative powerfully culminates in a highly idealized reunion with his beautiful wife at the gates of his idyllic plantation, a scene painted with the desperate beauty of a dying man's final wish. Just as he reaches out to embrace her, the narrative abruptly shatters this illusion with a stunning physical blow to the back of the neck and a blinding white light. The brutally concise concluding sentence yanks the reader violently back to objective reality. Farquhar is dead, his neck fatally broken, swinging gently beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. This shocking ending is not merely a clever gimmick. It constitutes the philosophical core of Bierce's narrative design. It conclusively demonstrates that the entirety of the third section, the thrilling underwater escape, the sensory awakening, the arduous journey home, occurred entirely within the minuscule fraction of a microsecond between his initial drop and the snapping of his neck. Bierce brilliantly forces the reader to experience the ultimate deception of the human mind, which possesses the astonishing capacity to instantly construct elaborate alternate realities to vehemently deny the horrific inevitability of its own demise. The sheer volume of narrative space dedicated to detailing the fantasy versus the shocking brevity of the fatal reality underscores the incomprehensible processing power of consciousness. When faced with extinction, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge endures as a masterpiece because it successfully marries revolutionary technical innovation with profound psychological insight. Bierce meticulously simulates the chaotic and tragic resilience of the human mind at the moment of its complete dissolution. By compelling the reader to invest emotionally in Farquhar's vividly imagined survival, Bierce ensures that the final snapping of the rope is a genuinely visceral shock delivered directly to the reader, cementing the story's enduring legacy as a triumph of narrative misdirection and psychological realism. Let us now examine the work through its primary analytical perspective. Ambrose Bierce's An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge operates as a profound exploration of the human condition when confronted with the absolute certainty of mortality. Set against the culturally and politically fractured landscape of the American Civil War, through a humanistic and intellectual lens, the narrative dissects the profound disconnect between the romanticized ideals of warfare and its cold, mechanical reality. Peyton Farquhar, a wealthy Alabama planter and ardent secessionist, embodies the culturally ingrained mythos of the Southern aristocracy during the mid-19th century. He is a civilian who intensely covets the so-called larger life of the soldier and the perceived opportunity for distinction. Subscribing wholeheartedly to the dangerous dictum that all is fair in love and war. This deeply entrenched romantic ideology deliberately blinds him to the brutal, unyielding nature of military execution and warfare. Bierce, having served in the Union Army and having witnessed the unvarnished horrors of the battlefield firsthand, utilizes Farquhar's character to ruthlessly critique the perilous naivete of those who view armed conflict through the distorted lens of honor, chivalry, and adventure, rather than confronting its inherent tragedy and mass death. The physical structure of the bridge functions as a remarkably potent symbolic crossroads throughout the text. It serves as a literal and metaphorical liminal space, suspended cautiously between life and death, between the warring North and South, and fundamentally between objective reality and the sprawling, desperate landscapes of the human imagination. As Farquhar stands poised upon the wooden railroad ties with a hemp noose firmly fastened around his neck, he is violently stripped of his privileged societal status, his considerable wealth, and his political affiliations. he is suddenly reduced to the most fundamental and vulnerable human denominator, a fragile biological entity desperately clinging to the fleeting remnants of existence. The meticulously detailed preparations for the impending execution highlight the profoundly dehumanizing machinery of military conflict. The Union soldiers present on the bridge are described not as individual human beings possessing moral agency, but rather as mechanized extensions of unyielding military protocol. The commanding captain stands in absolute silence. The armed sentinels are explicitly likened to unmoving statues adorning the architecture. Death itself is personified as a solemn dignitary requiring formal manifestations of profound respect, a choice that emphasizes the chillingly bureaucratic, institutionalized nature of Farquhar's demise. The liberal military code enforces an entirely emotionless environment where a human life is systematically extinguished with the clinical precision of a mathematical equation. Intellectually, Bierce pioneers a remarkably sophisticated form of psychological realism by meticulously mapping the subjective experience of time, sensory input, and consciousness during the agonizing milliseconds immediately preceding biological death. Farquhar's perception of his surrounding reality fundamentally fractures as his primal survival instinct violently rejects the inescapable truth of his impending doom. The rhythmic ticking of his pocket watch, which is initially perceived as a mundane measurement of objective chronological time, rapidly transforms into a deafening, metallic percussion, closely resembling a heavy blacksmith's hammer striking forcefully upon a steel anvil. This significant auditory distortion signals the narrative's deliberate departure from objective, shared reality and its descent into the boundless, elastic terrain of psychological time. The human mind, faced with the unbearable prospect of its own immediate obliteration, constructs a meticulously detailed, entirely alternative reality in which the physical body miraculously defies impossible physiological odds to survive. Farquhar's desperate mental projection underscores a deeply humanistic theme central to the narrative: the overwhelming primacy of familial love and interpersonal connection as the ultimate, enduring anchors of human meaning. Confronted with the abyss, his final, most urgent thoughts are not centered upon political glory, ideological triumphs, or the preservation of the Southern cause, but rather on the comforting, vital image of his wife and children. The story operates as a devastatingly tragic testament to both the magnificent resilience and the ultimate fragility of human consciousness. Farquhar's traumatized mind valiantly builds an intricate conceptual bridge of illusion in a desperate attempt to escape the physical bridge of his execution. Within this fabricated psychological sanctuary, he experiences a seemingly superhuman spiritual awakening, perceiving the intricate musicality produced by the beating wings of microscopic insects. A second perspective reveals further dimensions of the work. From an aesthetic perspective, Ambrose Bierce's story is a masterclass in structural innovation, sensory manipulation, and the deliberate cultivation of a profoundly jarring artistic experience. The narrative form is divided into 3 sections, each employing a unique stylistic register to mirror the protagonist's psychological fragmentation. Section 1 utilizes a stark, clinical realism. The prose is stripped of emotion, employing precise military terminology and an objective narrative voice. The executioners are described with geometric exactitude. This methodical style establishes a baseline of unyielding reality. The aesthetic beauty here lies in its chilling restraint. Impending violence contrasts against the tranquil landscape, creating unbearable tension. As the narrative transitions into Farquhar's imagined escape, the style undergoes a radical transformation, shifting to an intensely lush, hallucinatory lyricism. Bierce weaponizes imagery to immerse the reader within the desperate machinery of a dying mind. Sensory details become preternaturally acute and overwhelmingly vibrant. Farquhar perceives the veining of each leaf and the prismatic colors in dewdrops upon a million blades of grass. The soundscape shifts from the terrifying anvil-like ticking of a watch to the audible music of gnats and water spiders. This hypersensory environment is paradoxical. Its breathtaking beauty is born exclusively from the agony of strangulation. The sand transforms into diamonds and rubies, while trees become giant garden plants, suffused with a roseate light. This dazzling aesthetic escalation seduces the reader into accepting the illusion, aligning our artistic experience with Farquhar's desperate hope. The ultimate aesthetic triumph resides in its devastating final sentence, which functions as a brutal formalistic rupture. After painstakingly constructing a euphoric vision of salvation, culminating in the impossibly perfect grace of Farquhar's wife, Bierce shatters the illusion with terrifying suddenness. The flowing prose is instantaneously replaced by blunt, factual finality. By forcing the reader to inhabit the aesthetic beauty of the delusion, the sudden return to the grotesquerie of a body with a broken neck swinging beneath the bridge generates a visceral shock. The aesthetic beauty was never a promise of escape, but rather the tragic architecture of a dying man's final breath. Finally, here are several companion works worth reading. Readers captivated by the psychological intensity and stark realism of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge will find profound resonance in Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. Much like Bierce's work, Crane's novel actively dismantles the romanticized mythos of the American Civil War, shifting the focus from grand ideological battles to the intensely subjective, often disorienting psychological reality of an individual soldier facing mortal peril. Both authors strip away the veneer of martial glory to expose the vulnerable, terrified human psyche beneath. Additionally, William Golding's Pincher Martin offers a fascinating thematic extension of Bierce's narrative device. The novel follows a drowning naval officer who seemingly survives a torpedo attack and struggles for survival on a barren rock in the Atlantic. However, much like Farquhar's desperate journey down the river, the protagonist's entire ordeal is ultimately revealed to be a prolonged, elaborate hallucination experienced in the mere seconds before his biological death. Both works brilliantly exploit the elasticity of psychological time, utilizing lush, desperate sensory imagery to explore the human mind's absolute refusal to accept its own obliteration. Finally, Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried serves as a brilliant modern companion piece that similarly grapples with the traumatic fracture between objective reality and the subjective experience of war. Just as Farquhar's mind creates a hyper-real tapestry of sights and sounds to cope with his execution, O'Brien's characters constantly blur the boundaries between literal truth and emotional fiction, demonstrating how storytelling and psychological distortion become essential, deeply human mechanisms for surviving the